2009 through 2014 Acura TL with the 3.5 liter engine, valve cover replacement. I'm Brian Essa from How to Automotive. I'm going to walk you through the steps of replacing the valve covers. Get started, we need to remove all the engine covers here, or the shields here around the engine. And to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to pop the little clips off here in the corners. So you're going to use a panel popping tool and pull the clips out, and you'll follow all the way around the perimeter and remove all the clips and pull off the covers. Next, we're going to remove the air snorkel here, and to do that, we're going to loosen the two clamps. So once you get those loose, then you're going to squeeze the clamp here and pull the hose off, and then squeeze the boot inwards towards each other, and then pull the boot off and then set it aside. Now we're going to remove the throttle body itself. We're going to remove the two 12mm nuts and two 12mm bolts. And then we're going to pull the throttle body off and just tuck it down here on top of the transmission. We're not going to unplug any of the connectors. To make quick work of that, I'm going to use my Milwaukee M12 3/8 drive ratchet here. This makes quick work of jobs like this. So once you get it unbolted, you're just going to tuck it down on top of the transmission right there and just leave it there. After that, you're going to disconnect the two vacuum hoses on the back of the intake here. Disconnect those and push them towards the firewall. After you get the two vacuum lines disconnected, there's a vent line here on the front. I'm going to take it off the front of the valve cover here and leave it connected to the intake there. After that, we're going to unplug the purge valve here. And then there's one vacuum hose right here going to the purge valve that you need to unplug and leave the rest of it connected. Next, we're going to disconnect the electrical connector here by squeezing the tab and pulling it off. And after that, we're going to remove the top engine cover. And I'm going to use my Milwaukee M18 fuel to make quick work of that and remove all the fasteners. This is a 10mm bolts here. So go ahead and remove these without tools like these Milwaukee tools. Jobs like this would take a long time. So I invested in these to make jobs like this easier. I'll leave a link for these in the description of the video. That way you can check them out. After removing all the bolts, you can use a little pry bar or flat blade screwdriver and pry up the cover here. Then you can lift it straight up and off and set aside. Next, there's going to be some 10s and 12mm bolts in here. I take the 10mm bolts off, but after taking it apart, I realized you only need to take the 12mm bolts out. So you're going to remove the 12mm bolts inside this cover, inside the intake here. Like I said, I'm removing the 10s, but they're not needed to be removed. I couldn't imagine doing jobs like this without tools like this Milwaukee impact gun here. They make jobs like this really extremely efficient. I would highly recommend that you guys check these out and add them to your collection. Now with all the nuts and bolts removed, you'll lift the intake plenum straight up and off and set aside. Before I do any more work, I'm going to put rags and stuff them in the ports here on the intake, on the lower portion of the intake. That way no debris, dirt, nuts and bolts or anything like that fall inside the intake and cause engine damage later. So on the front valve cover here, I'm going to remove the acorn nuts here holding the coils down. To do that, I'm going to use my M12 ratchet here to make quick work of that. Once you got the bolts removed, we need to pull the coils up here a little bit, and then on the back of the wire loom here, there's a couple little tabs that you flare open, and you can pull the wire loom harness off the little bracket, and then you flare these up open, and then there's you can squeeze the squeeze clamp on the coils and disconnect the coils and set the coils aside on your bench. To the side of the dipstick here, I'm going to remove the 10mm bolt holding the wire loom here down. And then after that, I'm going to remove all the 10mm bolts holding the valve cover itself down to the cylinder head. Once again, I'm going to use the impact gun here to remove the fasteners and make things faster. You also may notice that the engine bay is well lit, and that's because I'm using the new Milwaukee M12 underhood light. One of the advantages of the underhood light is I dropped the bolt here, and now I can just easily look down in the engine bay and see it. So I'm just going to use a little magnet here to pick that bolt out. Having proper lighting like this makes a big difference in jobs like this. I'll leave a link for it in the description. Now you can take a little flat blade screwdriver or a small pry bar and pry the valve cover off the cylinder head. And then you're just going to push the wire loom here out of your way. And then you're going to lift the valve cover up and out. Now I'm going to start removing the rear valve cover. And to make it a little easier, I'm going to remove this strut bracing here. So there's going to be 4 nuts on the passenger side and 4 nuts on the driver's side on the strut mount here to remove the bracket. After that, I'm going to remove this vent line here by squeezing the clamp and pushing the hose off the valve cover. Next, I'll remove the 10mm bolt holding the ground cable off here. And then the wire loom that goes through the timing cover here, I'll pop it out of the timing cover, and that'll give me some slack. So now the wire loom has two 10mm bolts that we need to remove, one there and one back here. So you're going to remove those two 10mm bolts. I'm going to use the M12 to make quick work of that again. Now that you got the wire loom unbolted, you can go ahead and unplug the coils and remove the acorn nuts that hold the coils down and pull the coils out. I found that to get the coils unplugged easier, if you unbolt them, lift them up a little bit, and then unplug them. Now you're ready to remove the 3 bolts here in the front, and then on the back side here, there's going to be 2 more bolts here that you're going to remove from the valve cover. To get to the bolts in the back, I'm going to use the M12 instead of the M18. It's a little more compact to get in these tight spots back here. Once you get all the bolts removed, then you can go ahead and use your pry bar and break the seal on the valve cover and pry it up a little bit. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to push the wiring harness and lift the wiring harness up. To get the wiring harness to lift up a little bit higher to clear the valve cover, I'm going to remove a 10mm bolt here and here, and that gives the wiring harness a little bit more slack. So I'm going to lift the wiring harness up and tuck it over the bracket here. So you'll flip it on the other side of the bracket like this, and that gives you another inch or two of room to get the wiring harness out. I'm also going to unplug the injectors here, and there's going to be a couple spots where the wire loom is clamped to this little metal bracket, so you just pop those out. Then you can take the wire harness here and lift it up as high as you can possibly make it and push it towards the firewall to get yourself some additional clearance, and then you can lift the valve cover up and out of the car. I also unplugged the injectors on the front cylinder head too and popped it out, and then there's a couple sensors here that I unplugged right here and here, the knock sensor and the cam sensor. I went ahead and unplugged those, and that gives me even more slack. And then right here, the wire loom is mounted to the little bracket here. If you squeeze the little tab upwards like this and slide the wire loom off, now that gives you a lot more slack in the wiring harness to push it back towards the firewall to get that gap you need to get the valve cover out. Now with the wiring harness pushed backwards and out of your way, you can lift the valve cover up and out of the vehicle like this. Now I'm going to clean the mating surfaces on the cylinder head here and scrape off any of the old silicone using a scraper that may be in the corners of the cam lobes here. So I'll scrape out the silicone, and I'll do that for front and back cylinder heads. When you're scraping the old silicone off, you want to be careful not to gouge the cylinder head. So you're going to clean front and back cylinder heads with all the silicone and oil off. And when you're cleaning these cylinder heads off, you want to be careful not to wipe the dirt and debris into the engine. You want to make sure you wipe it away from the engine. And I like to use a little bit of a brake clean and spray it into a rag like this, and then use the rag to wipe off the mating surface of the cylinder heads and scrape away from the internals of the engine. After you get that clean, the next we can peel out the old gasket from our valve covers here. So you're just going to grab it in the corner somewhere and just peel it up and toss that aside. Then we need to remove the tube seals. The way I like to do that is take a little flat blade screwdriver and put it in between the tube seal and give it a little tap with a hammer, and then drive the screwdriver in and then pry the tube seal over like this until the tube seal pops out like that. You'll want to be careful not to gouge into the aluminum valve cover. And you're going to go ahead and do all 6 of the tube seals. Go ahead and remove all those. And then after that, we're going to clean the valve cover up. So after getting your valve cover all cleaned up, I use a parts cleaner and a pressure washer to clean these. And we're going to go ahead and reinstall the new tube seals and gaskets. This is the part numbers I use. I will link these up in the description of the video. I'll start by putting the tube seals in. So I'll press them in by hand like this, and then I'll use a rubber or a mallet like this and tap the seals in until they're fully seated. Then I'll go ahead and start the new gasket and install that into the valve cover. There are a left and right one, so you have to make sure you got the right one matched up. And you just press the gasket into the groove of the valve cover until it's fully seated all the way around. So our next step is to change out these rubber grommets that are on the bolts here, and they come with the kit. They're included. So what we're going to do is what I like to do is just take a pair of side cutters like this and cut the grommet in half, and then you'll just peel off the old grommet once you get it cut in half like that. Then once I get the washer and grommet removed, I take a new washer and grommet, put it in a vise like this right here, kind of set the gap up in the vise here, put a little grease or lubricant in the new grommet. Then I'll take a hammer and lightly tap the bolt back through the grommet, and with the grease it'll go on nice and easily. Now before we install the valve covers, I like to put a little dab of black silicone in the corners of the cam lobes here on each one of the cylinder heads, and I use the Right Stuff made by Permatex. There will be a link for it in the description of the video. So once you get the silicone on there, then you can lift the wiring harness up here, and we're going to feed the rear valve cover back in first. So you feed it back into place. After it's seated back onto the cylinder head, you want to double check the gasket and make sure it did not fall off. I use a little dental mirror like this and look all the way around the valve cover and make sure that nothing has gotten pinched between the gasket and the cylinder head. And then after that, I go ahead and reinsert the bolts. The bolts, you kind of have to wiggle around to kind of line up the holes. On the rear valve cover, the 3 short ones go in the front and the 2 long ones go in the back. Once I have all 5 of the bolts started, I use my Milwaukee M12 ratchet here to run the bolts down just until they touch. I'm not tightening them down with a ratchet. I'm just running them down until they're snug. Now I'm going to use a regular handheld ratchet here and a 10mm socket with a little extension and run them down until they're completely snug. And then I'm going to tighten them down until they're bottom out, and then maybe about a quarter turn or so more. I'm just kind of doing this by feel, and you kind of feel the gaskets crush down. And then I'm doing this in a crisscross pattern, so I got started in the middle, one in the back, one in the front, another one in the front, and then go back to the back again. After that's done, I'm going to move on to the front valve cover and go ahead and install that. Make sure that the gasket didn't get fall off or nothing's pinched between the gasket. Then I'll go ahead and install the bolts and run them down until they're snug. And I'm going to use the M12 again to run those down. And then I'm going to use my hand by hand. I'm going to tighten the bolts down in a crisscross pattern. So I'll start in the middle here on the top bolt one, and I'll tighten it down till it's snug, and then about a quarter turn more, then I'll just go in this crisscross pattern until all 5 of the bolts are tight. Now we are ready to start reassembling the wiring harness back here in the back and resecure the loom. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and install this vent line here onto the valve cover. After that, I'll go ahead and install all 3 of the coils back here in the back. Before I push the coils all the way down into the seated position, I like to plug in the coils with them floating above like this. So it's a little easier to get to the plugs and plug them in. Then you can just push them down into their seat and then start the acorn nuts and tighten those down. Now I'm going to position the wiring harness back into place and remount the mounting bolts that hold the wire loom down to the block. And bolt up the ground strap to the cable here. So I'm going to go ahead and bolt down the wire loom here with the 10mm bolts here. And then the one further back in the back here. Once you get those 2 secured, then you can come around the front here and the wire loom and start the 2 10mm bolts that hold the wire loom. Go ahead and bolt up the ground strap cable here, tighten that up, and then tuck the wire loom back into the cover of the timing cover back here. Make sure that's all tucked back into place. Now you're ready to plug in the cam sensors here. After you get that plugged in, you can plug in all the injectors here on the back. So make sure you get all the injectors plugged in, and then the little wire loom holders that went into the bracket, go ahead and clip those back into place. So after you get all 3 in the back secured, clip these clips back into place like this. And then you can come around the front here and plug in the front injectors and make sure that the wire looms are plugged back in. Then you can plug the knock sensor back in. And then any other of the electrical connectors that you unplugged or took out of their little mounts, go ahead and resecure that at this time, including the one here in the front by the alternator where it mounted on the little bracket right here. Go ahead and plug that in. The 10mm bolt that held the wire loom on the front harness in, and then reclip the little clips back onto the little catches on the wire loom holder here and press it back into place. Now you're ready to install the front coils, so you'll slide those into position, plug them all in. You may have to float the harness up a little bit to help plug them in. And once you get them all plugged in, now you can go ahead and remove the rags, remove your old intake gasket here, plenum gasket. And we're going to replace them with new gaskets. Here's the kit I use. It comes with everything you need to reseal the upper intake manifold, including throttle body gaskets. So go ahead and select the intake gasket here and slide it back on over the studs. I will link this kit up in the description of the video. That way if you need to pick it up, you can find it there. Now you're ready to take the plenum and slide it back on over the intake here. And once you got that done, you can go ahead and start the 12mm bolts and run them down until they're snug. I'm going to use the Milwaukee again to run those down. It has a variable trigger, so I can run it right down to where it just barely touches without torquing them or tightening them down with the gun. I just run them down till they touch. After we get all the bolts run down, and I did this in a crisscross pattern also, you may notice. After they're all run down until they're snug, then we'll torque the bolts down by hand. So now I'm going to torque the intake manifold down in a crisscross pattern. And I'm going to use a foot-pound torque wrench and torque them down to 16 foot-pounds. And like I said, once I get this bolt torqued down, I'm going to go in a crisscross pattern. So I'll go here, 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 and here. And just like in a crisscross pattern, there's no set pattern, just make sure it's crisscross. So I took the 10mm bolts out, but I learned after taking it apart, you do not need to take those apart. But if you did, you want to torque those down in a crisscross pattern also at 9 foot-pounds. So now we're ready to reinstall the top cover, but we need to change the gasket out here. It comes with the a new one in the kit that I'm going to link up in the description. So change out the gasket on that, then you can reposition it back over the plenum here, and we can start all the 10mm bolts, plug in the electrical connectors and the vent line here. So I ran all the bolts down until they were snug, then used a 10mm ratchet and a torque wrench set to 9 foot-pounds and torqued all the bolts down in a crisscross pattern. Now we can remove the old throttle body gasket here and install a new one that's supplied with the kit. Then we can put the throttle body back on, start the 4 bolts, and torque the throttle body down to 16 foot-pounds. Now you can plug in the vacuum line that went to the purge valve, plug the purge valve electrical connector back in, and then after that we're going to plug in the 2 vacuum lines in the back of the intake manifold back here, so you'll plug those in. The larger line is for the brake booster. Don't forget to put the clamp back on that. Now we're ready to install the snorkel boot here. I just squeeze it together and slip it between the 2 and then start all the hoses into the snorkel boot. And the wire here slips through the rubber grommet on top of the snorkel boot. After that, we can go ahead and put the strut mount brace back in and go ahead and start the 8 bolts, nuts and bolts for that. After you get the brace bolted back up, there's a little spot right here where the brake booster hose mounts onto the brace. Just slip that back into place. Now you can go ahead and put the center rear cover on first, and then you can start laying in layers the left and right side covers on top, like this and this, and start all the clips. And that'll complete the job of replacing the valve cover gaskets on a 2009 through 2014 Acura TL with the 3.5 liter engine. I'm Brian Esser from How To Automotive. I'd like to thank you guys for watching my videos, encourage you to subscribe, invite you to head over to the howtoautomotive.com website for more valuable videos like this, and to remind you that I'll link up all the parts and tools in the description of the video. Thank you again for watching.